Good afternoon to the faithful and on time. It is great to be with you. Should give out like a special code word and then a prize at the end for those who are here, but alas. So it is greetings from the General Conference. As the introduction said, I'm the General Counsel for the church, and I am relatively new in that position. A lot of you may have known my predecessor, Koenig Dukmetsian. Koenig gives his greetings. He is in the transition to retirement. He's still helping us out over the next few months. But he is on the, like I said, in the process of retiring, and we've appreciated his work helping in this transition. He served in that position for about 16 years, and I hope to follow in his footsteps. You know, the position of General Counsel, and I've worked for the church now earlier in February, about 3 weeks ago, I celebrated my 20th anniversary working for the church. And in that time, I've had the opportunity to see a lot of different problems that the church has. When I first got hired in, there were people that said, and a lot of secular people were like surprised to find out, wait a minute, the church needs lawyers and has lawyers? And the answer to that, of course, is, well, yes, we do. And one of the reasons that we need those lawyers is because to protect the church, to help it do its duty, but also because it turns out the church is filled with a lot of imperfect human beings. And just to be clear, the lawyers are not exempt from that. But we often see sort of the worst side of the church and when there's been problems. And that can give a certain perspective. And oftentimes what we see that coming from and what's causing that is an issue I want to talk about today, as you can see from the title, but values, morals, and ethics, and how we apply those in leadership positions. Because the reality is, everyone here in a leadership position is going to find themselves challenged with moral, ethical dilemmas through their career. And you'll also find yourself challenged with moral and ethical temptations, for lack of a better term, in your career as well. And I'm sure that's already happened. And what I want to talk about today is how to help identify those, how to help resolve those, and how to help minimize those. And if we had that perfectly instituted in the church, a lot of what lawyers deal with, not everything, but a lot of it would be really minimized. And so if we start off, we talk about is what are ethics and what is their point? This quote here says, when people accept responsibility for their own conduct and for the well-being of others, ethics serves to stabilize society. Ethics and the morals and values that we have is what keeps us together as a society. And that is necessary for the church to do its mission. This is going to be a theme I'm going to talk about a couple times in the presentation. And that is the church's biggest threat is not from those who would attack it from outside, but from people within the organization that don't necessarily live up to the morals, ethics, and values of the church. And this afternoon, I'm not going to talk about what those moral ethics and values are, right? That's not the point of this. You're all Seventh-day Adventists. You all grew up in the church. You all study the Bible. You can come to that conclusion yourself. What I want to talk about is how to think about this, how to recognize problems, and how to eliminate those. It says, ethics assures us that there is a distinction between good and evil, right and wrong, and the individuals have a moral obligation to do their best to discover and do the right thing. This idea for Seventh-day Adventists, for Christians generally, is very much baked in, right? The idea that there is good and evil, that there is an absolute right and wrong. And that sometimes can get distracted and get sort of confused, right? I remember a few years ago, when we send out missionaries, we send them to something called Mission Institute. And one of the points of Mission Institute is to allow people to be able to operate in a multicultural environment, right? And what that teaches people is that just because you do something one way in one particular setting doesn't necessarily mean it has to be done in the other. This idea that we adapt to the culture that we're in, and that is necessary to spread the gospel. The Seventh-day Adventist Church in Bangkok, Thailand, or SSD is going to look very different than where I grew up as a kid in the Midwestern part of the United States. But we assume, as Seventh-day Adventists and under a moral and ethical framework, that there is something that's absolute right and wrong, that there is good and there is evil. And that isn't always reflected in everything about the church, music styles, other worship styles, and so forth. There can be a large variance in, but there are certain things that we do believe is a difference between right and wrong. And I want to talk today about how we can approach that, and how we can think about that in our leadership styles. And as leaders, as Christians, as I said, it is absolutely imperative that we follow and set an example. It says, because people who are working on behalf of others, which is us as Adventist leaders, they're expecting, even in the face of tempting personal or political gains, to do the right thing as determined by certain universal and timeless values essential to ethical life. Doing the right thing. You know, I remember growing up well, I shouldn't say as a kid, I was in college. I don't want to go into too much detail on this, but there was a situation in which a very senior leader in the undergraduate institution I went to had, for lack of a better term, misled and had said one thing in public about a situation, and I'd heard him say something the complete opposite in private. And it was pretty clear to anyone who was paying attention to the system, to what was going on, what he said in private was the truth, and what he said in public was convenient. And that was disconcerting to me. I'm like, listen, this person's in charge of this institution. This person takes a leadership position, and they're just, going and making stuff up because it's politically expedient. The ability to disillusion people, not just young people, but people of all ages in leadership, so much harm can be done if we're not careful. So, what are we hoping to do today? I want to increase our commitment to do the right thing. I want to talk about how we can be conscious of moral and ethical issues as they came up and be able to engage in principled reasoning and problem solving as they relate to ethical conduct. And it's not always an easy decision. We're going to talk about a couple of case situations, how to handle things. And it's not always entirely obvious what the right direction is to go. There can be, and we're going to talk about values and what those values are, is what do you prioritize, right? What is the value that you're going to make the most important when making a decision? And oftentimes, choosing one path means a different path is not followed. And it isn't always entirely obvious which is the right one. And there's a lot of reasons for that. First of all, we put a lot of pressure on individuals to act and to do things, to have technical abilities and to get stuff accomplished, right? And a lot of times it's easy to say, well, if we just kind of set this one little thing aside, it'll make our ability to get the job done a lot easier, right? Like, our budget really doesn't support paying these individuals, the full salary that we're supposed to under the law. So, if we pay them underneath the table or we cut their salary a little bit, that'll help get the gospel out, right? There's a saying about people often act the worst when they're acting in the name of God or in the name of good, right? Like, well, this is about spreading the gospel. And if you use that sort of rationale, you can justify almost about anything. And so today we want to talk about how we as a society or as Seventh-day Adventist Christians sort of evaluate that. And the reality is, for us as leaders, oftentimes pushing the boundaries on what is ethical, pushing the boundaries on what is moral seems to be rewarded, right? Because there a lot of times doesn't seem to be consequences when people misbehave. And we've all seen situations where people have not followed the ethical prohibition. In the I don't know, did Uncle Arthur's bedtime stories, did that make it to Asia? Were those read too? You know, in those stories, right, at the end, the person who did wrong, good was always rewarded, evil was always punished, right? And the people always learned a moral story. Well, ultimately, that is going to be true in, you know, in the grand scheme of things with Christ's return. In the shorter term, that's just not how things work. We often see situations where misbehavior, pushing ethical boundaries is rewarded. I'll give you a secular example. When, as you all know, both in Cambodia and through most of Asia, there's the Grab app, right? Very popular, can get transportation, food, stuff delivered to you, very convenient. Well, the predecessor, the sort of progenitor of that, the first idea of having these app-based transportation companies came from Uber. And that was started in the United States. And it was very disruptive at the time because in the US, the cab companies had a lock and a monopoly on transportation. And where Uber really started, its core at the beginning, was in New York City. And to be a yellow cab in New York City, you had to have a medallion. And those medallions went up in price. They used to be cheap, but they went up in price thousands and tens and thousands. And before they got done, there were hundreds of thousands of dollars for that medallion. So if you had one of those, you know, it was a license to print money, and you didn't really have to worry about being responsive for customer service because you had a monopoly. And so Uber came in, and it disrupted that entire process for cabs, right? But it did it in a way, and I'm not going to get into the technical legalities of it, that really pushed the law on whether something was legal or not. And that was sort of baked into that company's DNA. And they started in New York, spread throughout the US, and of course around the world, and really revolutionized transportation and how people connect, and significantly undercut an industry that had a lot of problems, meaning the cab industry. And the founder of that made a lot of money. Now, he eventually got sort of pushed out of the company because the corrosive effect of not following the rules caused them to not just push the law, but go out and absolutely break it. One of the favorite things they came up with was that they were able to discover through various ways when like law enforcement would create an account to try to catch Uber ride drivers, you know, breaking the rules and so forth. And then for those individuals, they would follow the rules. But they really pushed it. But again, the guy who founded this, you know, became a billionaire, right? Even though he did eventually lose control of the company. But as Christians and Seventh-day Adventists, you know, our goal isn't to push the boundaries and make money, it's to share the gospel. And when we don't follow in an ethical way, that really undercuts our mission and our ability to do things in a way that makes it, you know, pointless. Because, you know, yeah, maybe you got this particular project off the ground, maybe this initiative was done, but if in that process you're not upholding the ethical and biblical grounds, you know, what good is that? And again, as I said, people often has this perception that ethics, you know, and morality and honesty is not the best policy. And in the short term, it can often seem that way. So again, one thing though I think in talking about this earlier is we need to make sure that we don't confuse that having an ethical and moral framework that we all can agree on and work from doesn't mean that we act, speak, and think all the same. It doesn't mean that we all answer the questions the same way. We are a diverse group of individuals. God created us this way with different viewpoints and different opinions. So ethics, morals, values, those aren't supposed to be cudgels to be used to say, well, either you do it my way or you're unethical or you're immoral, right? That is not what this is about, and it's not what we call about as the ethical Christians. It's about having sort of a base set of principles that we can all follow, but within that range of ethical and moral conduct that we operate in, there's a wide diversity of how to do things. So we've been talking about these words a lot this morning. morals, values, and ethics. And the terms all have slightly different meanings, and we're going to jump into that in a second here. But one thing I want to make clear on is, don't get hung up on, well, is this a value? Is this a moral? Is this an ethic? Putting things in exact categories. These are broad terms that have somewhat, agreed upon meanings. But again, different people will look at these in slightly different ways. So if you're saying they're like, well, Todd, I really don't think, that's more of an ethical issue than a moral issue. That's a value and not a moral. Again, talking about what we did before, we can see things in different ways. So what are we talking about values? So those are core beliefs or desires that guide and motivate attitudes and actions. They primarily concerned about what is right. And we can have different values, right? So some people, giving an example, might value time with their family over, say, work in their career. And they may intentionally, not progress as far because they want to spend time with family. Other people may be more career motivated. Some people may be more motivated for public speaking and value the ability to stand up front and be in that position. Other people have values that more are behind the scenes, right? And so we all have these different things that we think are the most important. I'll give you an example. I hesitated saying this and don't want to have any offense, but, in certain cultures, there's a value of standing in a queue and getting in there, right? If you're in the United Kingdom, UK, England, there is nothing worse than you can do than, jump a queue. That's a very strong value. At lunch today, I was going through line, and apparently the line, and I saw this a couple different times, the thing, they had ran out of food over the other one, and so the nice little lady just kind of came over, and I turned around, and she was in front of me, just grabbing food off right in front of me. And I'm like, okay, well, yeah, that's fine. In certain cultures, that value would be breaking all kinds of cultural values. In others, it's not. And we're going to talk later about how to evaluate these and the way to look at this. And again, I want to make it clear here, in that particular case, there's no particular right or wrong answer. There are other times in which there are right and right answers to values. But that's sort of the bedrock that we come from. And then the morals, this is about what is right and wrong. So it's applying really the values into what is right and wrong. So you have a particular value, honesty, integrity, and then what does that morally mean? So, a value would be honesty, a moral would be lying is immoral. It often talks about religion, sex, drinking, gambling, honesty, etc. And as you can see from this, different people have different morals. Different people have different values. And ours, of course, are informed by the Bible. And that is our guiding star and guiding principle. But, for instance, on the issue of gambling, right? There's many people who feel there's nothing immoral about gambling. Other people, based upon their values, and there's a lot of values that can come in their family, stewardship, etc., feel that gambling is wrong. Drinking, we have a certain belief on drinking within the Seventh-day Adventist Church, based on the Bible and the spirit of prophecy. Again, there are other people who would say, no, drinking in moderation is fine. Again, different people have different morals and values. We're going to talk later about how to evaluate this. Again, this talk isn't about what is the moral and value, but how to evaluate those. Just by the way, the timer up here is not working, so I guess I'm doing fine on time, but just FYI. So again, the last thing is on ethics, right? And ethics is really the application of your values and your morals. And it's the code of standard that you go by. And again, that's distinguishing right and wrong. If you don't have a set of values and you don't have a set of morals, thank you, then there is no ethical framework, right? So think of ethics as applying those to you, what your values and your morals are. And, ethics can be omitted, right? Like there are people who have no ethical principles. They may understand intellectually something is immoral or evaluate a value, but no, they're just going to go ahead and do it anyway. And again, that's what we want to talk about, as Christians. Now, I'm going to guess everyone in here believes themselves to be an ethical and moral person. In fact, almost everyone does think they're ethical and moral. But what often we have is that two misconceptions here. One, our ability to self-deception, deceive ourselves about our ethics, are we moral or our ethical values, and that our example, what we're putting out there is perfect, and that is the standard by which people can look at and guide. And again, stressing here, none of us are perfect. And we want to talk about how we can deal with this issue of self-deception. I'll tell this story later. Well, actually, right here is that. Go back one. When I was a kid, we went to. There was a local public pool there in my hometown, and went with a family friend, people from church that we knew. We were not related by blood or adoption or anything like that. And the way the entry system worked is, if you were a family unit, you could get a discount, right? And so I was there with them, and the adult who was taking us, it was their family, and I was joining with them, was like, "Oh yeah, Todd's one of us," and got the discount. It was a couple of bucks at most. It wasn't really that much money, but the way they excused it was, "Oh well, we're all part of the family of God, right?" So when they say family gets this, discount, we're all part of the family of God. And to that adult's credit, she ended up realizing and called me later and said that she called the pool up and had paid the difference. And so that goes to both self-deception and that the example is perfect. So again here, this is a story about, at the turn of the century, a Russian noblewoman attends a play. Russian peasant has died. Being a compassionate person, she cries as she left the theater, whereupon she goes out and finds her own footman had died, right? This idea of, oh, I'm a good person in the context of a play, in the context of sort of a public sphere, I believe that I'm doing the right thing and I'm a moral and ethical person, yet in their own personal life, that they find out that they're not setting really that good of an example. Here's another example, too, I want to talk about is young child steals a pencil from a local store. He's caught and brought home by the police. The father handled the situation by paying for the pencil and making the kid apologize. Once the parent and they're alone, says, "Why in the world did you steal that pencil? It's so stupid. It's so minor. I can't believe you would do that." And then he says, "If you really wanted a pencil, let me know. I'll just get one from work." And that, of course, sends a very interesting double message. Now, I don't want to make it sound like if you have any writing utensils from work at home, that you're stealing from office, because if that's the case, then they should probably just fire me right now, because I've got more pens and pencils that I put in my suit coat. Now, is it any benefit that I actually half the time take those back? I hope so. But again, the difference there, of course, is that's just sort of the inadvertent part of working in the workplace. What I'm not doing is taking boxes and boxes of office supplies home and, self-improving, creating my own little office depot store, right? Again, setting that example. And of course, what the dad was trying to get at here was, why would you do this that you could get caught at and get in trouble, as opposed to what the dad was suggesting, which you would never get in trouble for. So how do we go about making ethical decisions? And they are the values and the ethics that we have and the morals we have. And this both creates both once in a lifetime dilemmas and everyday habits, right? There will be situations that come up ethically that you only have to deal with once or twice. There's also the ethics that happen time and time again. And having those habits and making those habits of being ethical and moral, it's so important to have those and to not compromise those, because when we've done, from time to time, we'll do forensic investigations and people have embezzled and stolen stuff from the organization. And almost always you find, first of all, very few, if any, people start working for an organization with the idea, I'm going to steal from it, I'm going to embezzle, right? There are some, they're just out there to steal, but that's the minority. Most people find themselves starting out very, very small. and then build up over time. I remember when I was in law school, I worked at a law firm, and just as an intern, and we did a lot of trust and estates work. And the one of the cases that we had, I think he was a physician, he had passed away, and so we're collecting all of this money that comes in from the estate. It goes into a bank account at the law firm, and then once the case is, the estate is done, we disperse it to the family members. Well, it was a fairly high wealth individual. So, there was like 50,000 coming in here and 25,000 coming in here and 70,000 coming in here and 10,000 here. And it kind of kept building up. And I was sort of working on this, and the checks kept coming. I was like, oh, we got another check today for 10,000 or 15,000 or 20,000 or whatever. And one of the partners there eventually said to me, says, Todd, one thing I learned about this a long time ago is, he said, never get excited about client money. And I was like, no, I was not going to steal from that client. Couldn't if I'd wanted to. Didn't even really cross my mind. But his point there was, create a habit, create a perspective that doesn't tempt you in any way. And there would be times later in my career, not that I was tempted, but opportunities came up, right? I remember a few years ago, we had a case, and we had paid some of the fees in advance to the attorney, and somehow, and I don't know how, and I didn't realize this until the end of the case, they had put me down as the client, like not the church, but just me, Todd McFarland. And so when they returned the money, which was all of $400, the check was made out to Todd McFarland, period, nothing else. And the organization wasn't expecting a refund or anything like that. There was no, no one was going to be missing this money. It would have been very easy for me to have just taken that check, cashed it, and no one, to this day, no one would know the difference. And again, I like to think of myself as an ethical person, but I also go back to what I learned when I was in law school, right? Don't get excited about client money. Guard the small things. Because what happens is, you steal the $400, right? You steal, it's no big deal. And we'll talk about some rationalizations later. And the next thing, it's $4,000, and then it's $40,000. And all of them are wrong, equally wrong, in a moral sense. But all of a sudden, you find yourself putting yourself in more and more jeopardy. Again, there are times when things are very easy, right? The simplest issue is, did you lie? Did you tell the truth? That's an easy situation. Unfortunately, do you cash the $400 check yourself, or do you give it back to the client or to the church that, paid the money? That's an easy one to do. There are times in which it's a lot harder. And I'll give you this example. See if you can recognize it. 2 spies enter a city in advance of an invading army. The spies hide in the house of a woman who agrees to keep them secret in exchange for favorable treatment when the city is conquered. Lies to the authorities when they come to her house. What do you do there? Well, the person that lied got themselves put in is one of the 4 women in the New Testament, right? That was Rahab. She chose the values of caring for justice in her family over honesty in her citizenship. And this, of course, comes up a lot. Again, not an easy thing to do. There's other examples from wartime and so forth where, do you tell the authorities that Anne Frank's family is upstairs? Probably not an ethical thing to do. I'm going to talk here about sort of 4 warning systems about you can take in difficult situations yourself. First would be sort of the kid on your shoulder. Would you be comfortable if your children see you doing this? Would you be comfortable with explaining this to them? Or would you be like, oh, this isn't necessarily the right thing to do? So it's sort of a mental sort of heuristic you can use for yourself. Like the other one is, if this showed up, I don't know what the major newspaper here is in Bangkok or in your part of the world. Where I live is the Washington Post. It's like, would you be comfortable with this being on the front page of the Washington Post? This was back when there was, physical newspapers. And again, most 99% of the time, what you do will never end up in the newspaper, let alone the front page. But just think about that. For me, one of the things that I think about as an attorney is, we have something called depositions, where you put a person down, you put them under oath, and you can examine them and ask them questions, and they have to answer. And one of the things I was like, could I explain this in a deposition, right? Would this be something I could explain if I'm really asked about it and cross-examined on it? The other one, of course, is the golden rule, right? If the shoe was on the other foot, if this was being sent back to me, would I be comfortable with this? And would others think that they want, how others want to be treated, right? And then the last one is rule of universality, right? If everyone did this, would it still be okay? Now that has some limits on it, because not everything is scalable, but the principle is there, right? Is if everyone was doing this, would it be okay? Now we're going to talk later about how the defense of everyone is doing it, so it has to be okay, doesn't necessarily apply. But again, how would society be if the rule that you're applying to yourself was for society? I'm going to tell you a story. This actually comes from a real situation, a friend of mine. Him and his son were going into a grocery store, and the son saw down on the ground a very expensive wedding ring, right, or engagement ring. And they knew it was expensive, it looked expensive, and they ended up going to a jeweler, and the jeweler confirmed real diamond, real ring and everything, worth tens of thousands of dollars. And so what do you do here, right? If you start looking through that, right? Well, in this particular case, the kid was there. And again, you know, person finds front page of the newspaper, Todd McFarland finds ring in grocery store, pockets it, sells it to jewelry store and pockets the money. Would you be comfortable with that? The golden rule, right? If I lost the ring, would a person want this? Would I want that to happen to me? And again, the rule of universality. If everyone just, when they found something, if they just sort of pocketed it, would that be a society you want to live in? Now, it gets a little more complicated, because what do you do here, right? So there's different approaches to this. One is, what they ended up doing was they went to the grocery store and said, hey, has anyone reported a ring lost? Now, for minor things, you might be like, oh, I found this out in the parking lot, right? You know, just as someone comes by. But for a ring like this, you also have to ask yourself, you know, is this going to actually be safeguarded by the grocery store, or is whoever I give this to just going to pocket it? Second issue is, does the person who lost this even know where they lost it at, right? Is this the most efficient way to get this back to them? So what they ended up doing was they sort of looked around, and there was I think a Facebook post or a community loss page, and they found what appeared to be and they confirmed that with they were able to describe the ring with specificity and returned it. But again here, we can look here at sort of this test of we're doing things right. Listen to the bells and the ethical issues as things are going wrong. You know, look and see, what does the law say, right? Is there a regulation or a law for this? Now, you can be as a very unethical and immoral person and follow the law. You can also, be breaking the law in times and still be an ethical and moral person. Those two don't perfectly overlap, but they generally do. For the most part, if you're breaking the law, you're violating some ethical or moral standard of society. There are extreme examples of this, but in most societies, that's sort of where we're at. And again, the candle thing, how would your decision look in light? Could a reasonable and fair-minded person concluded you acted properly? You know, the example I gave with the grocery store, there's a lot of different ways to handle that. Turning into the grocery store and saying, I found this, have a nice day, that would be fine. It may never have gotten back to the person, but no one would say that was unethical. And the way they handled it, of course, was fine as well. One here I also want to talk about here, this is maybe a little harder one, is you're a youth leader for your church group. Several youth want to attend summer camp, but don't have enough money, so you're doing fundraising. Parent calls up and said a small business wants to sponsor them. But they want to meet the kids. They want to sponsor 5 kids. But they want them to come over so they can get to know them. And because this is a pizza store, the kids will be excited. The problem is this, pizza store has gotten in trouble recently for not paying children correctly and violating child labor laws, right? And so do you accept this money? How do you look at that? Like, if you don't accept the money and say, oh, we're not taking money from unethical organizations, then 5 kids may not get to go to summer camp. So you ask yourself, right? And the first thing is, you should be asking yourself the question. And you ask, well, is it illegal to take the money, right? Probably not. Probably not a regulation against taking that. How will this look if it becomes known? XYZ Adventist Church takes money from local store accused of, cheating kids or violating labor laws, right? Again, we can all come up with justifications for not doing the right thing. And some of those rationalizations that are common is, well, is it necessary? If it's legal, then it's fine, I was just doing it for you, often just telling white lies. I want to serve, help that person out. It says, I'm just fighting fire with fire. They did it to me, reciprocity, right? This is why I can, do whatever I want to do. It doesn't hurt anyone. It's fine. No one's getting hurt. Now, oftentimes when you're talking about this, your definition of it isn't hurting anyone is very, very narrow, right? I remember listening to a stand-up comedian once talk about how when he worked at a movie theater, he would basically pocket part of the money. He would tell the computer that he was charging a kid, and he would charge the person as an adult price and just keep the difference. And it's like, well, the computer doesn't need any money. What good does it do it? Well, yeah, it was hurting somebody, right? It says, everyone's doing it, a false safety numbers. And oftentimes you'll find everyone isn't doing it. If I'm not gaining from this personally, I'm not making any money off of this, so it's okay. And it says, this number 8, I think, is one of the biggest I've ever seen. They feel overworked, underpaid, especially in the church, right? You don't make the best salaries necessarily. And I deserve this. They was mistreated in a certain way. And so therefore, accepting favors and so forth and so on is fine. And I can still be objective, right? Like even if, this person gives me this gift, I can still be objective. And so, as Christians and as Seventh-day Adventists, what I want to conclude by saying is none of us are as perfect as we might think we are, right? All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. But what we want to do as Christians is, and as Adventists is, be aware of these ethical problems and know how to resolve them and think about them. One of the other things I would encourage as well is, and it wasn't in the slide, is talk to other people if you're concerned. There's wisdom in counsel of others, right? And that can really assist in making decisions as well. And in our remaining here 2 minutes and 19 seconds, I think we've got a question here for discussion about this. And so I want to thank you today and